Welcome to the channel. I'm VRJ and today we're checking out Blade & Sorcery Nomad for the Oculus Quest 2. Blade & Sorcery is a single-player, physics-based fantasy sandbox fighting game. This is a game that's been available to PC VR players in beta form for nearly 3 years now, and I played a good bit of it on PC, but never with the kind of freedom that comes from a wireless experience. I'm just going to give my opinion here straight away. I love it. I'm actually finding that I enjoy it more on this headset than I do on my Valve Index on PC, which I'll explain in just a bit. First, let's talk about graphics and performance. Nomad looks and runs pretty decently on the Quest 2 headset. When they announced that this was coming to the Quest 2, I was surprised. It's always been a resource-heavy game. But even coming from the PC version, I was really impressed with what the developers were able to accomplish here. Aside from some fairly heavy foveated rendering and the downsized textures and models, it looks pretty damn good on my mobile headset. There are some visual glitches here and there and some muddy textures and pop-in, but it still looks like Blade & Sorcery despite running on a glorified smartphone. As far as performance goes, I would say that it runs decently smooth on the Quest right now. As long as I keep the currently experimental blood on weapons and blood on enemies setting off, I can maintain a steady frame rate with just a few hitches here and there in the bigger environments or when there are a larger number of enemies on screen. One thing that has really bothered me is that it will crash on me from time to time, mostly when I'm loading up the larger maps or in the dungeon mode. A few times I got the seriously frustrating endless loading screen and had to restart the game completely. There are also a few gameplay bugs here and there, ranging from textures not loading in or my weapons getting stuck inside of something. Nothing game breaking, and I'm sure these things will be improved over time, so I can forgive some of this stuff considering they got it to run smoothly on the Quest 2 at all. Bottom line is that it does the job. They managed to hold on to the visual style of its PC counterpart while also optimizing it for the Quest. It looks and feels great most of the time, but there's a lot of room for improvement. Graphics and performance gets a 3.5 out of 5 for me. Next, I'd like to talk about the auditory experience of Blade & Sorcery. In virtual reality, what you hear is about 50% of the experience, and it is an essential part of the immersion. Blade & Sorcery has this down. The swinging of the sword, stabbing and slicing, metal on metal banging together, the sound of your footsteps, your body and weapons interacting with different materials, and then there's the environmental and atmospheric sounds you hear. This is really nice, especially in some of the dungeon environments. The developers seem to understand how important ambiance is in VR. Instead of trying to explain this, I'm just going to show you a clip so you can hear it for yourself.
What?
Bottom line is that the audio immersion in this game is pretty much top notch, and I give it a 4 out of 5. But graphics and audio don't mean anything if the game isn't fun to play. So finally, and last but certainly not least, let's talk about the gameplay. Blade & Sorcery Nomad, in its current state, is a mostly physics-based sandbox that gives you a convincing and realistic VR sword fighting experience that also mixes in a little bit of magic. Your arsenal of weapons actually feel like they have some weight and momentum behind them. Unlike other VR fighting games, you actually have to put some real effort and precision into your swings and stabs. You can't just waggle your weapon in front of you and expect to win a match. It can get a bit janky with the physics-based stuff, and it can be a bit hard to get used to, but once you get it and things start to dial in, the combat in this game becomes super addicting. The past week I have done nothing else outside of going to work. It just makes you feel awesome. Believe me when I say this is the best melee fighting game in VR. The level of physics-based interactivity here is just not surpassed by anything I've ever played. The weapons feel tangible, weighty, and great to swing. All the weapons feel different from each other and have their own strengths and weaknesses. A single-handed weapon feels different from a double-handed weapon, and so on. The physics-based interactions and combat is like a dream come true for me. It just makes you feel badass. I don't know how else to put it. With 4 inventory slots, 2 on your hips and 1 over each shoulder, you can equip 4 different weapons or a health potion if you choose. And then it's off to wreak havoc on those poor creatures. The clashing of metal, banging together and slicing through enemies with satisfying ease, using magic attacks and Emperor Palpatine-like lightning from my fingers to torture these poor characters in any way I see fit. It's just an incredible experience. You do want to be careful who you play this in front of though. My mom came over once, saw me play for a bit, and I swear she hasn't looked at me the same since. It is a violent game in the best way possible. You can also imbue weapons with magic to make them more lethal or effective. I do wish that there was more options to make the AI a bit better at blocking attacks so that I could feel more like I'm in a skilled sword fight. The easy, medium, and hard difficulty waves that you can select from inside the sandbox mode more or less just give the enemies increasingly better armor, weapons, and adds more ranged attack characters. I think it would be really cool if the difficulty levels improved their skill with the blade. Right now there are 3 modes to choose from: Sandbox, Survival, and the brand new Dungeon mode that also recently debuted on the PC VR version. If you load up a map in Sandbox mode, you're given a book that lets you spawn in different types of weapons and enemies to which you can subject to unimaginable horror. Loading in on Survival mode pits you against waves of enemies, getting increasingly harder the longer you survive. And then you've got the brand new Dungeon mode, which is where I probably had the most fun. This is the newest addition to the game. You can access it by selecting the Greenland level. It spawns you into a procedurally built dungeon that changes and rearranges itself every time you spawn in. You can select from 3 difficulties and a small, medium, or large dungeon length. It's pretty simple. Move through the linear environments, dispatching enemies until you reach the very end. It's amazing how much that small objective can improve the experience, and it gets me super excited for the future of this game. This mode seems like it's probably just a small taste of what's to come in later updates. Speaking of which, when you first load up the game, you'll see a game mode called Crystal Hunt. Apparently this will add a progression-based dungeon mode where you can level up your character and purchase new weapons and armor. It's too bad we won't be able to access it until sometime next year though. One more thing that I want to talk about in terms of gameplay is the fact that I enjoy playing this game more on the Quest than I do on my Index. For some reason, when going back to the PC game, the weapons and everything just feels more sluggish. Almost like there's more latency or something, which absolutely makes no sense to me. Technically, the tracking and latency should be far superior on my Index with my Lighthouse trackers. Maybe this is because of the downsized physics engine? If anybody else has experienced this, I'd love to hear your take on why this is, or maybe it's just me. Bottom line is that it's hard to even explain how entertaining all of this is, so I'll just give the gameplay a 5 out of 5. Blade & Sorcery Nomad may be an unfinished game, but it does more right than it does wrong, and the devs have successfully ported most of base game Blade & Sorcery to the Quest 2. Bugs and glitches aside, it's still the best mobile VR experience I've had in 2021, and it's the best VR melee combat game I've ever played. If you're into physics-based VR sandboxes and don't mind waiting for some of the additional content, Blade & Sorcery Nomad is absolutely worth the $20 that it asks for. Overall, I give Blade & Sorcery Nomad for the Oculus Quest 2 a solid 4 out of 5.